So that might be one engineering reason why the communist solution doesn't work. Like I read in Solzhenitsyn, for example, that the Central Soviet authorities often had to make 200 pricing decisions a day. Now, if you've ever started a business or created a product and had to wrestle with the problem of pricing, you'd become aware of just how intractable that is. Like, how do you calculate worth? Well, there's the central existential problem of life. How do you calculate worth? It's not something like a central authority can sit down and just manage. And there is a lot of inputs that go into a pricing decision. And the free market answer to that is something like, well, if you get the price right, people will buy it and you'll survive.
This is a fascinating way to describe how ideas fail. So communism perhaps fails because just like with people who believe the earth is flat, when you look outside, it looks flat, but you can't see beyond the horizon, I guess. So
yeah, right.
In the same way with communism seems like a great idea in my family and my people I love, but it doesn't scale.
And it doesn't iterate.
It doesn't.
And that's a form of scaling too.
Right. Well, I mean, whatever ways it breaks down, it doesn't scale.
Yeah.
And you're saying religious thought is a thing that might scale.
I would say religious thought is the record of those ideas that have in fact scaled. Right.
And
right.
iterated. Well,
and iterated.
Does religious thought iterate? So, I mean, there's a fundamental conservative aspect to religious thought.
Yeah.
Tradition.
Yeah. This is why I like Mircea Eliade, for example, who I referred to earlier. One of the things Eliade did, and very effectively, and people like Joseph Campbell, who in some ways were popularizers of Eliade's ideas and Carl Jung's, what they really did was devote themselves to an analysis of those ideas that scaled and iterated across the largest possible spans of time. And so Eliade and Jung, Erich Neumann, they were looking, and Campbell, they were looking at patterns of narrative that were common across religious traditions that had spanned millennia, and found many patterns. The hero's myth, for example, is one of those patterns. And it's, I think, the evidence that it has its reflection in human neurophysiology and neuropsychology is incontrovertible. And so these foundational narratives, they last. They're common across multiple religious traditions. They unite, they work psychologically, but they also reflect the underlying neurophysiological architecture. So I can give you an example of that. So the hero myth is really a quest myth, and a quest myth is really a story of exploration and expansion of adaptation, right? So Bilbo, the Hobbit, he's a kind of an ordinary everyman. He lives in a very constrained and orderly and secure world. And then the quest call comes and he goes out and he expands his personality and develops his wisdom. And that's reflected in human neuropsychological architecture at a very low level, way below cognition. So one of the most fundamental elements of the mammalian brain, and even in lower animal forms, is the hypothalamus. It's sort of the root of primary motivation. So it governs lust and it regulates your breathing, and it regulates your hunger, and it regulates your thirst, and it regulates your temperature. Like really low-level biological necessities are regulated by the hypothalamus. When you get hungry, it's the hypothalamus. When you're activated in a defensively aggressive manner, that's the hypothalamus. Half the hypothalamus is the origin of the dopaminergic tracts, and they subsume exploration. And so you could think of the human motivational reality as a domain that's governed by axiomatic motivational states, love, sex, defensive aggression, hunger, and another domain that's governed by exploration. And the rule would be something like, when your basic motivational states are sated, explore. Well, and that's not cognitive. Like I said, this is deep, deep brain architecture. It's extraordinarily ancient. And the exploration story is something like, go out into the unknown and take the risks, because the information that you discover and the skills you develop will be worthwhile even in sating the basic motivational drives. And then you want to learn to do that in a iterative manner, so it sustains across time, and you want to do it in a way that unites you with other people. And there's a pattern to that. And I do think that's the pattern we strive to encapsulate in our deep religious narratives. And I think that in many ways we've done that successfully.
What is the belief in God? How does that fit in? What does it mean to believe in God?
Well, okay, so in one of the stories that I cover in We Who Wrestle with God, which I only recently begun to take apart, say in the last 2 years, is the story of Abraham. And it's a very cool story. And it's also related, by the way, to your question about what makes communism wrong. And Dostoevsky knew this, not precisely the Abraham story, but the same reason. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky made a very telling observation. So he speaks in the voice of a cynical, nihilistic, and bitter bureaucrat who's been a failure, who's talking cynically about the nature of human beings, but also very accurately. And one of the things he points out with regards to modern utopianism is that human beings are very strange creatures, and that if you gave them what the socialist utopians want to give them, so let's say all your needs are taken care of, all your material needs are taken care of, and even indefinitely. Dostoevsky's claim was, well, you don't understand human beings very well, because if you put them in an environment that was that comfortable, they would purposefully go insane just to break it into bits, just so something interesting would happen. Right. And he says it's the human proclivity to curse and complain. And he says this in quite a cynic and caustic manner, but he's pointing to something deep, which is that we're not built for comfort and security. We're not infants. We're not after satiation. So then you might ask, well, what the hell are we after then? That's what the Abraham story addresses. And Abraham is the first true individual in the biblical narrative. So you could think about his story as the archetypal story of the developing individual. So you said, well, what's God? Well, in the Abraham story, God is characterized a lot of different ways in the classic religious texts. Like the Bible is actually a compilation of different characterizations of the divine, with the insistence that they reflect an underlying unity. In the story of Abraham, the divine is the call to adventure. So Abraham has the socialist utopia at hand. He's from a wealthy family, and he has everything he needs. And he actually doesn't do anything until he's in his 70s. Now, hypothetically, people in those times lived much longer. But a voice comes to Abraham, and it tells him something very specific. It says, leave your zone of comfort. Leave your parents, leave your tent, leave your community, leave your tribe, leave your land. Go out into the world. And Abraham thinks, well, why? I've got naked slave girls peeling grapes and feeding them to me. It's like, what do I need an adventure for? And God tells him, and this is the covenant, by the way, part of the covenant that the God of the Israelites makes with his people. It's very, very specific. It's very brilliant. He says, if you follow the voice of adventure, you'll become a blessing to yourself. So that's a good deal, because people generally live at odds with themselves. And he says, God says, that's not all. You'll become a blessing to yourself in a way that furthers your reputation among people, and validly, so that you'll accomplish things that were real and people will know it, and you'll be held high in their esteem, and that will be valid. So that's a pretty good deal, because social people would like to be regarded as of utility and worth by others, and so that's a good deal. And God says, that's not all. You'll establish something of lasting, permanent, and deep value. That's why Abraham becomes the father of nations. And finally, he caps it off, and he says, there's a better element even to it. There's a capstone. You'll do all three of those things in a way that's maximally beneficial to everyone else. And so the divinity in the Abrahamic story is making a claim. He says, first of all, there's a drive that you should attend to. So the spirit of adventure that calls you out of your zone of comfort. Now, if you attend to that and you make the sacrifices necessary to follow that path, then the following benefits will accrue to you. Your life will be a blessing. Everyone will hold you in high esteem. You'll establish something of permanent value, and you'll do it in a way that's maximally beneficial to everyone else. And so think about what this means biologically, or from an engineering standpoint. It means that the instinct to develop that characterizes outward moving children, let's say, or adults, is the same instinct that allows for psychological stability, that allows for movement upward in a social hierarchy, that establishes something iterable, and that does that in a manner that allows everyone else to partake in the same process. Well, that's a good deal. And I can't see how it cannot be true, because the alternative hypothesis would be that the spirit that moves you beyond yourself to develop, the spirit of a curious child, let's say, what is that antithetical to your own esteem? Is that antithetical to other people's best interest? Is it not the thing that increases the probability that you'll do something permanent? That's a stupid theory.
So God is a call to adventure with some constraints.
A call to true adventure.
To true adventure.
True adventure. Yeah, and then that's a good observation, because that begs the question, what constitutes the most true adventure? Well, that's not fully fleshed out until, at least from the Christian perspective, let's say, that's not fully fleshed out until the Gospels, because the passion of Christ is you could say, this is the perfectly reasonable way of looking at it, the passion of Christ is the truest adventure of Abraham. That's a terrible thing, because the passion story is a catastrophic tragedy, although it obviously has its redemptive elements. But one of the things that's implied there is that there's no distinction between the true adventure of life and taking on the pathway of maximal responsibility and burden. And I can't see how that cannot be true. Like, because the counter hypothesis is, well, Lex, the best thing for you to do in your life is to shrink from all challenge and hide, right? To remain infantile, to remain secure, not to ever push yourself beyond your limits, not to take any risks. Well, no one thinks that's true.
So basically, the maximally worthwhile adventure could possibly be highly correlated with the hardest possible available adventure.
The hardest possible available adventure voluntarily undertaken.
Does it have to
It
be
has
voluntary?
to be absolutely.
How do you define voluntarily?
Well, here's an example of that. That's a good question too. When Christ is the night before the crucifixion, which in principle he knows is coming, he asks God to relieve him of his burden, and understandably so. I mean, that's the scene famously in which he's sweating, literally sweating blood, because he knows what's coming. And the Romans designed crucifixion to be the most agonizing and humiliating possible, agonizing, humiliating, and disgusting possible death. Right. So there was every reason to be apprehensive about that. And you might say, well, could you undertake that voluntarily as an adventure? And the answer to that is something like, well, what's your relationship with death? Like, that's a problem you have to solve. And you could fight it, and you could be bitter about it. And there's reasons for that, especially if it's painful and degrading. But the alternative is something like, well, it's what's fleshed out in religious imagery always. It's very difficult to cast into words. It's like, no, you welcome the struggle. That's why I called the book We Who Wrestle with God. You welcome the struggle. And Lex, I don't see how you can come to terms with life without construing it as something like, bring it on, welcome the struggle. And I can't see that there's a limit to that. It's like, well, I welcome the struggle until it gets difficult. Well,
so there's not a bell curve, like the struggle in moderation. Basically, you have to welcome whatever as hard as it gets. And the crucifixion in that way is a symbol
of that. Well, and it's worse than that in some ways, because the crucifixion exemplifies the worst possible death. But that isn't the only element of the struggle, because mythologically, classically, after Christ's death, he harrows hell. And what that means, as far as I can tell, psychologically, is that you're not only required, let's say, to take on the full existential burden of life and to welcome it, regardless of what it is, and to maintain your upward aim despite all temptations to the contrary, but you also have to confront the root of malevolence itself. So it's not merely tragedy. And I think the malevolence is actually worse. And the reason I think that is because I know the literature on post-traumatic stress disorder. And most people who encounter, let's say, a challenge that's so brutal that it fragments them, it isn't mere suffering that does that to people. It's an encounter with malevolence that does that to people. Their own sometimes, often, by the way. Soldier will go out into a battlefield and find out that there's a part of him that really enjoys the mayhem. And that conceptualization doesn't fit in well with everything he thinks he knows about himself and humanity. And after that contact with that dark part of himself, he never recovers. That happens to people. And it happens to people who encounter bad actors in the world too. If you're a naive person and the right narcissistic psychopath comes your way, you are in like mortal trouble, because you might die, but that's not where the trouble ends.
if there's a young man in their 20s listening to this, how do they escape the pull of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground? With the eyes open to the world, how do they select the adventure?
So there's other characterizations of the divine, say in the Old Testament stories. So one pattern of characterization that I think is really relevant to that question is the conception of God as calling and conscience. Okay, so what does it mean? It's a description of the manner in which your destiny announces itself to you. And I'm using that terminology, and it's distinguishable, say, from Nietzsche's notion that you create your own values. It's like part of the way you can tell that that's wrong is that you can't voluntarily gerrymander your own interests, right? Like you find some things interesting, and that seems natural and autonomous, and other things you don't find interesting, and you can't really force yourself to be interested in them. Now, so what is the domain of interest that makes itself manifest to you? Well, it's like an autonomous spirit. It's like certain things in your field of perception are illuminated to you. Think, oh, that's interesting, that's compelling, that's gripping. Rudolf Otto, who studied the phenomenology of religious experience, described that as numinous. Thing grips you because you're compelled by it, and maybe it's also somewhat anxiety provoking. It's the same reaction that like a cat has to a dog when the cat's hair stands on end. That's an awe response. And so there's going to be things in your phenomenological field that pull you forward, compel you. That's like the voice of positive emotion and enthusiasm. Things draw you into the world. Might be love, might be aesthetic interest, it might be friendship, it might be social status, it might be duty and industriousness. Like there's various domains of interest that shine for people. That's sort of on the positive side. God is calling, right? That would be akin to the spirit of adventure for Abraham. But there's also God is conscience, and this is a useful thing to know too. Certain things bother you. They take root within you, and they turn your thoughts towards certain issues. Like there are things you're interested in that you've pursued your whole life. There are things I'm interested in that I felt as a moral compulsion. And so you could think, and I think the way you can think about it technically is that something pulls you forward so that you move ahead and you develop. And then another voice, this is a voice of negative emotion, says, while you're moving forward, stay on this narrow pathway, right? And it'll mark deviations, and it marks deviations with shame and guilt and anxiety, regret. And that actually has a voice. Don't do that. Well, why not? Well, you're wandering off the straight and narrow path. So the divine marks the pathway forward and reveals it, but then puts up the constraints of conscience. And the divine in the Old Testament is portrayed not least as the dynamic between calling and conscience.
What do you do with the negative emotions? You didn't mention envy. There's some really dark ones that can really pull you into some bad places. Envy, fear.
Yeah, envy is a really bad one. Pride and envy are among the worst. Those are the sins of Cain, by the way, in the story of Cain and Abel. Because Cain failed.